Welcome, listeners, or should I say hello, my darklings, to another episode of Pop Screen, the Geek Show podcast dedicated to movies starring about, or in this case, written and directed by pop stars. No, the movie podcast covers such a broad range of musical and cinematic genres, from documentaries to science fiction, from country and western to hip-hop. I'm your host, Graham Williamson. I'm a film critic for The Geek Show and a filmmaker myself. I also write for Horrified.com, the British horror website. And I've been joined this week by...
Ewan Gleadow, hello.
Hello, where can people find your work, Ewan?
People can find my work on cult following Clapper, Geek Show, and now more recently Spark Sunderland. That's all new.
Nice. Well, Glenn Danzig is clearly a man with some kind of aesthetic. The stylized skull logo of his first band, The Misfits, has been worn on comfortably more t-shirts than you'd suspect anyone who has ever listened to the band's music, unless, you know, I don't know. I try not to profile, but I look at some people wearing Misfits t-shirts and I think maybe some of you are not big fans of 1980s hardcore punk, but it's fine. It's no wonder with this kind of track record that he would branch out into visual media, starting his comics company Verotika, a portmanteau of erotic and I guess. And making this film adaptation of 3 stories from that comics line. It's called Verotika. It was compared upon its premiere to The Room, and I kind of hoped that would be the Oscar-winning Brie Larson movie, but listeners, it really, really, really is not. So, I said before we've joined that I wanted to send you a link to the Zoom meeting for this and a formal apology for making you sit through this.
I mean, you know, this is our job, but there are times in our careers where I question why we're here and why we do the things we do, and this was one such moment. I really like So Bad It's Good films, but there's something about watching them at like 2:30 in the afternoon, sleep deprived from work. It's like it loses its edge a little bit, or it's going to tip me over the other side. And I don't know what happened with this. When I was doing my notes and research, I couldn't help but notice that Glenn Danzig's most recent album is an Elvis Presley covers album.
That's exciting. I would prefer to listen to that than watch Verotika again.
Well, that's the thing. I think I would watch Verotika again. I'll just put that out there. I would. Not for the right reasons, not for Danzig's reasons. It's very much a... See, this is why we don't let musicians direct films. We learned this lesson with Fred Durst and The Fanatic, but here we are again. Yeah, I mean, it probably doesn't help just to put it out there. I'm not the biggest fan of horror, modern horror especially, because to be honest, it's not even an artsy snob thing. It's just I'm quite easily frightened. Don't like stuff like that. Terrified. But Danzig, no trouble there. Nothing very terrifying about this one. More confusing. And I'm sure we'll get into that.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's the most confusing, completely linear film that I've ever seen. Like anyone could sit through Inland Empire and come away perplexed, but there's a certain magic to watching something that has no plot twists whatsoever and coming out and thinking, what the fuck was that?
I've never seen something so simple yet so fascinatingly confusing in all my days. I think a lot of it, you know, it'd be hard to just dismiss this as bad as The Room, because it is. But I think the reasons behind it are so vastly different to what The Room was going for. And it's kind of just odd in a way.
Yeah,
it's just really...
The thing about Danzig, I mean, his music isn't for me. I think my impression of it, Danzig, the band, are kind of his take on like early metal, like Black Sabbath and stuff like that. No, right, that's not my thing. The Misfits I quite like some of because it's more punk inflected and I like punk music, but it's never been something that I've been like massively into. But he's not a dumb guy. You know, he's talked about his favorite directors and he's mentioned Jean Cocteau and David Cronenberg. And you'd think that a filmmaker influenced by Jean Cocteau and David Cronenberg would produce something really great for their first movie.
And it's that there. It's the difference between, is he replicating the quality or is he replicating the tone? Because there are moments in Verotica, I hate to say it, where my first thought was, if this had been directed with a bit more competency, David Cronenberg probably could have pulled that off. It's especially the opening of the very first one, where the man and the woman are on the couch. Stuff like that kind of reminds me of Cronenberg, but not. Cronenberg would never do anything that stupid. But,
and it's remarkable because we are doing a Cronenberg film for this Halloween month. Our Halloween special is going to be Videodrome because Debbie Harry's in it. And it's remarkable to think that there was once a time when Cronenberg was dismissed as just this schlock and gore merchant. Or he's the guy who casts porn stars and pop stars, and he has them sort of disemboweled and grow weird organs out of themselves. He just does gross out stuff. But yeah, I'm struggling to see the underpinning thematic intelligence in Verotika.
I think that's the one issue I have, and it's not just with Verotica, it's with a lot of these sort of segmented episodic films. It's that there is a tone or a message that links them all together most of the time. With Verotica, there isn't, apart from these are horror.
That's the thing, isn't it? I think that's the most crucial problem with it, because he is going for that EC Comics Tales from the Crypt kind of vibe. It's an anthology film. It's a lot of sort of gory horror stories with a host in between making bad puns. And you can see that that's exactly what he's going for. And it's a fine thing to go for. I think it's, a venerable tradition, but it makes you realize that even though Tales from the Crypt isn't terribly sophisticated in a lot of ways, there is a craft to that kind of storytelling. They tell little tales with a twist, which is like the oldest and most satisfying form of horror, campfire stories. Whereas the standard story in Verotica is there is a killer, right? And they're killing some people. And then it ends when either they are killed or they get away and go to kill more people.
Now, I imagine we've both seen at least 3 films that do that sort of thing.
Oh shit, spoilers everyone, by the way. I just didn't think about that.
It's that simplicity that really does. I mean, there's a hell of a lot that draws back Danzig's style of direction, but the simplicity of his story and why he repeats it twice after we've seen it once already, it's mind-blowing. I think I suppose there is a sort of sense to it though as well, because the one big thing for horror is consistency, and it's knowing and identifying what works, such as a killer getting away with a lot of killing. It's the slasher effect. It's if you can show that well and often enough, it might turn to something well, like the Freddy versus Jason series that just culminated in absolutely nothing. But stuff like Verotica, it's on paper it does make sense why he's wanting to do this. It's like, oh, and then the opening of it was very much Elvira-like, where she pokes the eyes out of the woman and then she turns to the camera and like, this is Verotica. It reminded me of the old sort of, I hate to use these two names in the same sentence, but Glenn Danzig's direction here reminded me a bit of Alfred Hitchcock when he did the TV show, and he would introduce
Alfred Hitchcock Presents. Yeah,
that's the one. Yeah. And it's that effect that he's going for. And it's like you've said, Danzig's a smart guy. He knows who to cite as his references. And it's clear who's influenced them, but he tries to replicate them rather than draw from what he's learned from them.
In fact, let's go a bit further. I think despite the sort of weird pointlessness of being introduced to your host as she gouges someone's eyes out and then they're never mentioned again, which is, yeah, okay, fair enough. I think the host parts are the part that I found the easiest to enjoy. I think they have their own kind of corny rhythm. I think Caden Cross, who plays the host, is pretty charismatic. She's an adult film star, and this is one of those horror movies that has a lot of porn stars in. And most of the time I was thinking, oh no, how terrible for them to be trapped in something that doesn't have the cinematic ambition and carefully tuned dialogue of their day work. But Cross is pretty good, and I thought those segments were the nearest it gets to being fun in the way that it wants to be.
Yeah, and I think that's where Verotica, we can kind of not defend it, because to defend Verotica is sort of just
It's a doomed mission.
Something I would not do. But it is where the sort of Danzig realizes this is the closest he'll get to realizing whatever his vision was. It's the late night Saturday entertainment where they're introducing little horror segments.
Completely.
And it's nice, and it definitely could have been handled better because the gore and the effects do look quite cheap.
Yes, yeah.
But for a first time effort, there is at least sort of an ambition there, which you don't quite
Yeah.
see sometimes.
And I can sort of enjoy some corny bad gore effects and bad puns in a sequence which is going, as you say, for the sort of Elvira Mistress of the Dark approach rather than something that wants to. Well, let's jump into it. Let's talk about that first segment, which is called the Albino Spider of Dejette.
Do we have to?
The first thing that struck me is like you're introduced to this scene and somebody's giving a blowjob, but there's a spider in the background, so it's horror, right? It's definitely horror.
Yeah.
The woman is like begging her boyfriend to keep her shirt on, which just made me think this is what the contract negotiations to star in Verotika must have been like.
It probably was. They don't have the budget to do this sort of thing. I will say though, you mentioned the spider there.
Yeah.
I don't listen to much heavy rock. I used to live with someone that used to listen to a lot of heavy rock.
Yeah.
And my understanding of heavy rock, sort of not being influenced or seeing it firsthand, but sort of observing it from afar, is that people think spiders, sex, and satanic symbols are very scary.
Yes,
and that's it.
Yeah.
They use that as logos and emblems. It's like if I put like a spider on this jacket, people would think, oh, he's in a Black Sabbath, sort of that sort of thing. It's like just broad images that you can shove in there, and I don't think Danzig's capable of letting that go. Where it's spiders are scary, aren't they? Maybe in the 80s,
yeah. I mean,
40 years beyond that.
I was just sort of thinking, it's just wonderful to imagine that Danzig, who is, I believe, 66 years old, 66 years, let it sink in. Danzig is like filming this spider thinking this is going to freak people out. Earlier this year for Pop Screen, I watched the Apple TV documentary about Billie Eilish, where she's like relaxing at home and just letting tarantulas crawl all over her because she thinks they're cute. And it's like, yeah, this definitely, this isn't going to hit a younger generation in the way that you want it to, I think.
I mean, to be fair, I'm probably part of that younger generation. I spent a lovely week in the 90s when I was born, but other than that, I'm kind of the new generation. But
yeah,
I'm arachnophobic. I'm terrified of spiders. The spider in this opening segment and also the opening credits, it's not good. It looks dreadful. It looks like the sort of CGI that was used in like the first Spider-Man movie, but somehow even worse. It's like that matte effect where it's the spider feels rather bulky and sheeny, and it just doesn't look right, and it just looks off, like Toy Story does. But Toy Story at least has nostalgia to it, as does the first Spider-Man.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
it's that style of animation and the CGI that just it doesn't sit right, especially not when you've got HD camera equipment.
Oh God, no. But let's go back to the woman who's trying to keep her top on, which in this movie is just the most doomed effort that you can possibly have. Once her top is removed, she has, and I assume this is what triggered your sort of Cronenberg recollection. She has.
Oh, it triggered my fight or flight response more than anything. It was terrifying.
She has eyes for nipples, or as her boyfriend sensitively puts it, your teeth, they're looking at me.
They're looking at me. Oh, that was one of the many moments in this film where my sleep-deprived brain just sort of cracked in half. I'm like, oh no. But it was when you mentioned Danzig's age, 66. My first thought wasn't, oh, that makes sense. It was just kind of oh, bless him. He's trying something new at his tender old age. Because what's he doing here? Really? Like, this is a guy that cites his influences, not just in film, but is like Elvis Presley, Jim Morrison, Sergio Leone. He's influenced by some of the greatest artists of the 20th and 21st century. What's he doing here? Like, I don't see the correlation between who he's influenced by and
Yeah.
what he's actually putting out there. It's like me saying I'm influenced by like Dostoevsky. I can't write like that. I'll never write like that. But for me to say that is pretentious.
It's weird, isn't it? I mean, I think I can understand someone who enjoys watching sort of Leone and Cocteau sort of wanting to do something that is just a big, fun, trashy horror workout because big, fun, trashy horror workouts are big fun.
Yeah.
But there is definitely something in this which is, in fact, there's a letterboxed review that I went to in researching this from Lee Kolks.
Yes, yeah, I read this one too. Yeah,
he was there at the premiere, and Danzig is entirely earnest about this. And I think he wants it to be kind of grindhousey, but he doesn't want it to be corny. I think the nearest thing to that he said was, he said, the film isn't concerned with 20-minute long shots at the beach with no dialogue, like all that Hollywood bullshit. It's like, for a start, has somebody played a practical joke on Glenn Danzig? Have they lent him a DVD of Abbas Kiarostami's 5 long takes dedicated to Ozu and said, you want to see the new Spielberg, Glenn?
Someone has opened a fake DVD shop near his home, but every DVD is either a ghost story or Satan Tango. And he's been stuck watching these 2 films on a loop for years, and he's about ready to flip. So he's made this sort of inconsequential, lacking cohesion nonsense trilogy as a fight back against Bellatar, and more power to him.
Glenn Danzig sat watching the tracking shot of the bottom of the river in Tarkovsky's Stalker, thinking, Jesus Christ, Star Wars has gone down the drain, hasn't it?
He's sat watching Ben-Hur tapping at his wristwatch going, well, it's a bit long, lads, you can cut this down. I think it's the brevity of time that he wishes to adapt here. It's that people, he respects the time of the audience. They've no time to learn character names or what needs to happen. And I think, I don't know if it's me just being uptight about the horror genre, but the best horror experiences I've had are where people are just getting hacked and slashed, and it's just very, one of the nicest things about the later Nightmare on Elm Street films, which to be honest are awful, but their creativity is something I can appreciate, especially when it's sort of pop culture relevant. There's a one kill that was like very close to Aha's Take on Me video, and it's sort of stuff like that I can appreciate. Verotika doesn't have that, and I think that's the issue. Is that if you're going to make a horror trilogy in the modern era, then you kind of got to use pop culture either to your advantage or to criticize. It's not impossible to do it without, but I think someone like Danzig certainly needs to, because he's got nothing else to say. And really, the fallback would be, let's criticize something easy, like pop culture.
Yeah. And I mean, it doesn't help that sense, as you say, of trying to work out what kind of world this is rooted in and what kind of movie this is going to be, when you've got a lot of American actors doing very bad French accents in the middle of a city that is still very obviously Los Angeles and has signs saying Los Angeles all over it. I mean, I am a big fan of certain 70s Euro horrors where they're aimed at like an English language market, and they're set in some kind of weird Italian or Spanish conception of what America might be like.
Yeah.
But I don't think this is what Danzig is going for.
I think Danzig's concussed for much of the direction of this film. And it kind of shows in the technical aspects where it's sort of, it's very plain. It's very, he's rented an apartment, moved the couch to one side of the room and said action, and then away they go.
Absolutely.
It's the opening shot when it sort of tracks into the room, and the spider, God bless it, it's still there. But as he's swooping around, it's like a bottle of champagne that somehow looks wrinkly on a table next to a couch with just sort of generic throw cushions and pillows and stuff. It's that weird set design where it looks like a show home, but you can tell it's a set.
And this is one of those things that I think every young filmmaker who's starting out should learn. Absolutely do not make your film in a show home. It is both better and cheaper to find a mate who will allow you to film there for a weekend, because the house looks actually lived in. It looks real. As soon as I see a show home in a film, I don't think, woo, that's a lavish big home. I think this must have been made for about 10 pence.
Yeah, and it's sad though, because Danzig doesn't have any friends. But I'm sure if he did, he would have asked them, and they would have promptly said no, because they don't want spiders on their walls. But yeah, you bring up a good point there though, and I think that's. I hate to just keep ragging on the genre, but one of the issues I have with horror is that, especially modern stuff, the stuff that I'm sent screener wise, it looks very cheap. It's they've built a set and it doesn't look lived in. It just looks like they've went to IKEA, bought the bits of furniture they needed for this scene, and then they'll keep the receipt so they can return it later on.
Yeah, and it's that lived-in quality that bothers me. I mean,
Yeah.
the original Evil Dead is a cheap film, but everything in it is believably worn and used and rickety and tumble down when it needs to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, I guess he would have tried to assimilate those qualities into his work, but it's obviously, I suppose we can give credence to the fact that this is his first time directing, and he's coming from an art perspective. He's coming from music into film, and it's a big gap to breach. There's definitely a lot of musicians who have made the leap rather well, like David Bowie. David Bowie did it gracefully, but he didn't direct. And
yeah, I'm trying to think of a musician who was like had a solid directing career. I mean, we reviewed True Stories a bit back, and that was great, but I can't imagine David Byrne making a second film.
Yeah, he couldn't have followed that up, and especially from sort of a career perspective, he wouldn't have been attached to project. You know, he wouldn't have been asked to do Rambo 3, or he wouldn't have been on the next Hollywood set.
If he had, you'd watch it, right?
Without question, it'd be Rambo in the red convertible from True Stories, swerving in and just going, I don't quite like it here. I'm going back to Texas. And then he just spins the car around, and the whole film is just him on a road trip. Lovely.
Absolutely.
Delightful.
I've always thought Rambo should have been played by Spalding Gray.
He'd have been phenomenal as Spalding Gray, as Rambo.
He spent quite a lot of time with Spalding Gray. Yes.
Yeah, because I can't think anybody apart from genuinely Fred Durst with The Fanatic, which is a delightfully awful film. And to be fair though, there's big names in music that have dabbled in films that have just not pulled it off, like Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan did a film with the writer of Borat. The name escapes me.
Masked and Anonymous,
Masked and Anonymous,
completely incomprehensible film.
But it's stuff like that. That's, I suppose, you know what, we could probably, I mean, the Beatles with Hard Day's Night, again, they didn't direct it though. So
no. It's that there just seems to be some sort of barrier between being able to express yourself artistically in a lyric and being able to express yourself artistically in a film that people just don't seem to jump, and I don't know what that would be.
I suppose Nick Cave got the balance quite well with The Assassination of Jesse James.
True.
But again, didn't direct. And I suppose it's a matter of too many poles in the fire at that point. Then if a musician wants to direct, especially in the case of Danzig, who, you know, a trilogy of stories in a 90-minute window for a first-time director, it is a big ask.
It is,
because usually those anthology films like VHS, they're usually one or two directors taking on a project and saying, well, I'll do this segment, I'll do this segment. Like, I remember XX from a couple of years back. They had a fair few directors, but I don't remember that too well. But yeah, he's usually, these sort of anthology pieces have different messages because they've got different directors. If you've got one director for all segments, you're going to get the same sort of project, really.
Yeah, I mean, the Coen brothers did it pretty well with the Ballad of Buster Scruggs, but I think it's a tall ask to compare Danzig with the Coen brothers in many ways, because like the tragic thing is, I mean, we've been ragging on the opening story, but that's where he like gets rid of all of his ideas, isn't it? The albino
Oh
spider of the
yeah,
jet.
yeah.
That's the one which actually has some stuff happen in it. And the next two are just almost kind of goodbye dragon in levels of nothing happening slowly.
He burnt himself out after 40 minutes.
He burnt himself out where in the scene in The Albino Spider of Dejette, where a newsreader talks about a body found with a broken neck and finishes the report by saying, "Police are calling this murderer Le Neckbreaker." That's it. That's his golden moment. You can't top that.
Now, as someone who has studied journalism for 3 years and now works in it, I would not publish that headline. I don't know. I mean, we've had occasions where, obviously not murderers, but repeat offences have happened.
Yeah.
We would not call them, if someone was stealing soup, we would not say we are now calling him soup thief man. It's the lack of focus on things that matter, like dialogue, like little names like that, like Le Neckbreaker.
Yes.
He's ambitious in the wrong areas. So obviously you've got nipple eyes and a spider being some sort of message for whatever he's on about.
Well, it turns into a sort of, not in the way that you were comparing it to another film earlier, but it turns into a kind of a Spider-Man. And this is it's literally a big, tall, sort of sheet white guy with 8 limbs. And that's a tall ask for a low budget feature film. And if I had written that into a script, I would definitely like check whether it was possible to have all of those limbs move.
Why didn't he just go down the usual independent director approach, make a family drama in a house that's being lived in and make it a box office success, and then do something else later? You're not going to do John Carpenter's Halloween. You're not going to turn up and make $70 million on like 250,000. And I feel like there are moments in Verotika where Danzig's like, this is going to be the big sleeper hit. This is going to be my Blair Witch project. And I suppose, there's not a chance. This is one of those films.
You were going for the redemptive reading for a second really there, weren't you?
But then my brain clocked on to what I was saying and stopped. Because I was going to say, it's like midnight screenings aid these films a lot.
Yeah.
Now, Rocky Horror Picture Show is on a completely different level. That's a great movie. But it was aided by midnight screenings. Same for The Room. And I imagine stuff like Birdemic and the films of Neil Breen would benefit from that as well. I don't think Verotika would, because it's just so awkward at times. Not because of the acting or the technical merits. It just feels like this is a man actually trying. This is like his best shot at it. And there is something a little sad about that. Not in a sort of sad, mocking way, but genuinely I'm quite distressed for Danzig. He's given it a go. This is like a passion project, and it's turned out so terribly.
Because the thing about Glenn Danzig is that he seems to be at this level in his career where people do mock him, yes, but people still mock him with a lot of affection behind it. There are still so many metal fans who will talk about the Danzig records and Misfit records as being absolutely formative, and nothing he says or does can take away their love for it, which is great. And I think he misunderstands it. He could lean into it. He could become a kind of Shatner figure who's kind of shrewdly in on the joke of how people see him. But when people, for example, as recently happened, found a picture on his girlfriend's Instagram of him wrapping Christmas presents and they made memes of it, he was really annoyed by that. He thought it was really like beneath his dignity. And I just thought, well, you can't turn this around just by sort of stamping your foot. You have to lean into it a bit.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that this might take us a bit off track, but it's sort of the reappraisal that people give to American comedies of the early 2000s. Stuff like Freddy Got Fingered, stuff like Dirty Work from Tom Green and Norm Macdonald, respectively.
Yeah.
That sort of reappraisal, it doesn't reignite their career, but it lets people see them in a different and more broad light. And what Danzig has here is the opportunity to become even relevant to a small pocket of the internet that may not know him for his work. And it's that extra audience that can guide him to sort of something new after Verotika and after all of his musical work. And it's, I suppose it's a matter of just, from his perspective, it's a matter of self-respect that he is known for this heavy metal stuff, and he really sees himself as this guy that conjure up fear out of imagery that just isn't scary anymore. And he's sort of clinging on to the past a little bit, but at the same time, it's very hard to accept a new image of yourself 40 years down the line after what made you famous is still, I imagine, quite popular even on a modern scale. I imagine there's heavy metal rock bands that are out now.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, even as an outsider, one of the things that I really respect about metal is that it's always had a consistent large audience, and there have been some times when it's been very fashionable and it's been very easy to get that audience, and there are some times when it's been totally unfashionable, but that hasn't changed the fan base, which I think is really endearing.
That's precisely it. It's sort of, genres in pop culture will come and go, but obviously metal survived for so long. It's not exactly a Britpop or country scenario where they've sort of just up and down and then just died off for a bit, and then Mumford & Sons or William Shatner come in and start trying to revitalize the thing. But metal has always been very consistent, where it's broad enough that it has so many subgenres to it that it probably can't die unless everybody sort of up sticks and move to a new genre. Because for every Glenn Danzig, you've got someone like Ozzy Osbourne, who, while they might look very similar with the black long hair and the sort of bats and spiders persona, their music's vitally different.
I mean, you mentioned trying to frighten people with unscary imagery, and my notes immediately went to the start of the second story, Change of Face, where I said, at least when cop movies have a scene set in a strip club, there's something else going on in the foreground.
Yeah, I think what's happened here, and I'm no expert, I didn't work on the film, but I think Danzig has accidentally left his camera on when just going about his day. And once he realized that this had happened, he spent £20,000 on recorded footage, and his producers have said, well, what are we going to do? You spent £20,000 recording scenes of a strip club. And he went, aha, I'll make this a fucking story. I'll do it. And that's it.
Boy, does he ever do it.
Oh, God. It's one of the, I suppose, to some degree, his appeal for this movie is the gore and the guts and the blood and the sort of softcore pornography that's
the boobs, to a great extent. It is a very titsy
boobs,
movie.
Blood, guts, and gore is essentially what he's going for. Now, there's a fine line between installing it into your narrative and just having a strip club promo halfway through your movie. He doesn't quite straddle that line as best as Danzig could, but I suppose it's like he's trying to set the scene, but he does it for too long. He does it for 20 minutes, like those pretentious Hollywood movies that he doesn't seem to like that much. But the literal context of the title of that segment as well is just, it's too on the nose to mean anything, which is ironic because the other two are too confusing to mean anything at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And it has another great sort of police scene where they go outside and find that the killer, who is just called Mystery Girl, has left a victim with her face peeled off, and one of the cops just goes, "There's your motive. They wanted her face." Not exactly cracker, are you?
Did you not see that Columbo episode where he was hunting down the face ripping victim, and he's like, that's their motive. They like faces. It's very much Hannibal Lecter, but a la The Office, when they did a riff on him in that one episode where he cuts the face off and wears it and goes like,
Just one more thing. I couldn't help noticing on my way in that you have a collection of people's faces nailed to your wall.
It's an art installation. It's an old Andy Warhol we found in the attic. I like to think that there is a point behind all of the faces thing where it's sort of one person could be many but the same. But I don't think Danzig's bothered by what subtext is.
No, I mean,
In the great words of Garth Marenghi, subtext is for cowards.
yeah, he definitely believes that subtext is for cowards. I mean, as you say, there's great potential in this idea of someone, a stripper, who is defined by her image and who she is visually, taking the faces of other people. But even when you've got all this stuff, you've got the ripped off faces, you've got her having no name, you've got her stripping while wearing a mask, you've got all of these things that are being plugged in. Danzig still doesn't have a change identity. When she tries to escape and like flee the cops and go to another club, she changes her name from Mystery Girl to Mysteria. You think, yeah, that'll throw him off the scent, won't it?
It's very much like a Grand Theft Auto scenario where you turn a corner and you just sort of stay there, and then everybody forgets you there, and you can just drive back out into the very people that know what you look like. It's not as if, ironically, the whole changed face thing, it doesn't really do much. It's
No.
They know who they're looking for. If they just follow the pile of bodies without faces on them, they're bound to look up something, aren't they? But it's the lack of consistency in the script that really hurts this one, and I guess that's because Danzig wrote it as well. But again, yes. For a first time,
you've got to stop saying for a first time. For a
first time,
for a first time, this is bad, right? Night of the Living Dead is a first time horror film. This isn't good.
But ironically, with George Romero, the two best parts of his series, Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead, his subtext didn't even occur to him, especially not for Dawn of the Dead, with the whole, they're all returning to the supermarket because consumerism is a venomous little parasite. It's ironically, when George Romero learned the meaning of subtext, his films went downhill.
They actually became a lot less subtle in a lot of ways, didn't they? Yeah.
Because subtext is for cowards, especially in the horror genre.
Yes.
But no, I think there is a line between. So I think there's three categories. There's somehow someone making the film so incredible that their first time sets up a chain of brilliant films like George Romero, like Quentin Tarantino, like Wes Anderson.
Mm.
You've got the middle category of people that are sort of, all right, they'll rise up later on, like Taika Waititi. His first few films, they're okay. And then, you have What We Do in the Shadows, which is quite good. And they've got the one he did with Sam Neill, Hunt for the Wilder People.
Beautiful.
Is it Hunt for the Wilder People? Fantastic, yeah. And then you've got the third category of people who have made awful films, aren't going to bounce back from it, but are still going to get work.
Yeah.
So people like, I can't remember his name, but I was meant to interview him and it fell through. The guy that directed the Sweet Life on Deck movie and Cats and Dogs 3. he did a film about surfers.
I wanted to jump in straight away there, but you have defeated me.
What were you going to say?
I did. As soon as he said I can't remember his name, I thought, oh, I'm good at movie trivia. I'll come in. And then I heard what his credits were, and I thought, oh no, I'm completely lost.
Sweet Life. Sorry, I'm just googling the Sweet Life movie. Sean McNamara.
Okay.
He's directed such classics as, and then so Glenn Danzig's first effort. He's given it a go, and I don't think it's for him. But he's done another feature as well, so we'll see how that goes.
Yes, yeah, I can't remember who's in the cast for that, but I have a horrible feeling we'll have an excuse to cover it if we want it. But yeah.
Well, that's the thing. It's ironically, considering how bad he is at direction. I made a note, and I think I can barely read my own writing, but I wrote the Twist of Cain Fine or Fire. I can't quite make that out. From his first album. It's quite good. I don't mind that. I wasn't sorry when it had stopped, but I wouldn't have paused it either. So, I think as well, it's difficult for him to stand out now because this just in sort of the context of the day we're recording this, it's been a very strong day for music. Damon Albarn and Jarvis Cocker both released a new song, a piece. ABBA's got new songs out and they're making a new album. So to kind of dive into Glenn Danzig doing Elvis Presley covers is a bit hard to swallow.
Yeah, I must admit I didn't do as much musical research as I normally do, and I think it would be a bit of a weird shift going from that gorgeous new Saint Etienne album or Little Sims to this.
It's, you know, what was it? He was in Danzig, and I was looking through Danzig's records. So they did Danzig 1, 2, and 3, and
Mm.
they seem to have been very well received. And then they did an album just titled 4, and
It's
then
good.
5.
It's shaving it down, more minimalist.
It's subtext is for cowards, and then it's when he gets to 5, 6, and 7. And bearing in mind this is 96 to 2002, it's stuff like Black Acid Devil, Satan's Child, I Luciferi, which I imagine is to capitalize on the success of I Robot, but I could be wrong. But that trilogy there it's the Satanism symbolism that has been so mass produced in that period of time that it just doesn't mean anything anymore. And in hindsight, it's not scary.
I
What
think
is scary is Danzig Sings Elvis, which released last year.
yes. I think after the sort of black metal bands in the 90s in Scandinavia, where they pushed their sort of fondness for Satanism into burning down churches and carrying out actual murders, there's a sense that, that you can't
They've
go
one
any
upped them.
yeah, you can't go any further down this path, and
No.
equally you can't just put like a bat on the cover of your album and have everyone go, oh no, anymore. It's
And I
kind of
think
a dead
that's,
end.
yeah, it's very much a sort of how sensitive people are to what they see in film. Like I imagine that people in the 30s, when The Mummy and Dracula and Frankenstein were all coming out, terrifying. So obviously it's the famous story of Alfred Hitchcock would wait outside of the screenings of Psycho, and people would run out because they were that terrified. That, I think, to me as well, personally, I don't find Psycho particularly scary. But the reason it survived for so long is that we can appreciate the cultural value it has and the impact it has on the genre and what it means for the genre. With Verotika, there's no such sentiment to that. And I imagine it's because he hasn't moved on from what made him famous in the 80s and the 90s, which is the sort of satanic symbols, which were for a time scary, but the culture has become incentivized to just not care for them because they've seen it that much. It's always in the pop culture remit. So eventually something's going to lose its meaning and its emotional response. For Danzig, that means his whole shtick as this kind of heavy metal rocker, it's gone. He can't get that back.
Yeah, I think when you've got satanic imagery in like Lil Nas X videos, it becomes harder to say that, oh, this is outside of the musical mainstream.
Precisely.
We've got an upside down cross and everything. And I think it's ironic that you should say this, that it's no longer shocking. And I think you're right, by the way, but it's ironic considering Danzig's own attitude that he's not the worst for this, but he has been doing a bit of going on about cancel culture and how people today are too sensitive. And it struck me as kind of revealing that he said something like, oh, back in the punk rock days, we just did what we did and we didn't care if it offended people. You can't do that nowadays. People would get offended. You think, well, that sounds like the world hasn't changed that much. It more sounds like, you haven't changed that much.
Precisely, yeah. And I think as well, just to sort of add to that, it's a lot of stuff like the Sex Pistols and the Clash. It was their point was to cause offense. It was to challenge the norm. But there's a big difference between challenging the norm and retaining the stereotypes and the provocative imagery of something that no longer has that effect. So when people say, move on, that's not, it's not relevant anymore, such as satanic symbols, it's not a matter of people are still offended by it. It's people just don't care because it's lost its meaning.
Sometimes this process is good. I mean, you mentioned the Sex Pistols. The fact that the Sex Pistols no longer sound like the most extreme, frightening, noisy rock band you've ever heard has actually exposed that underneath it all, they were always a pretty tight rock and roll band. And
Precisely,
it's easy to appreciate that now.
It's always going to be the case of, like, there'll be artists working now that people find distressing and offensive. In 20 years' time, will be considered geniuses of the genre. It's a matter of perspective and the It's like we mentioned earlier about Dirty Work and Freddie Got Fingered. It's the reappraisal that comes over the passing of time and a new generation. It's, the Beach Boys and Pet Sounds.
And just to clarify, you think that all of this will happen to Verotika? You think it'll come
without
to be
question, yes,
known as the Pet Sounds of the horror genre? Yeah.
I'm happy to be quoted as saying that Verotika is the Pet Sounds of the horror genre. I'm not a betting man. I've made 2 bets in my life, and I think it's just coincidence that I've won them both. I'm willing to make a third. That by the end of this decade, Verotika will have been reappraised.
I mean, I wouldn't bet against it because one of the things that often makes people come round to a film, to an older film, is when you can look back at it and say, God, can you imagine anything being made like this today? And sometimes that's a delusion. People can say that about The Exorcist. There weren't many films made like The Exorcist when The Exorcist came out. That's why it was a sensation. No one had seen anything like it before. But I think it will be very easy to look back on Verotika and say, this aging heavy metal musician got the money to make a trilogy of almost entirely plotless horror stories with a bunch of porn stars. That's really weird. That would never happen nowadays.
Precisely. And I do think to some degree that Danzig still thinks, I've made a horror movie, it's got sex symbols and it's got porn stars and it's got spiders. He thinks that's probably pretty rock and roll, which in of itself, the term rock and roll and the whole, that sort of thing, that I've just cringed on the inside doing that. But that itself is outdated, when at a time it used to be very cool and a very provocative image.
Shall we? Yeah. Shall we go on to the third segment? Because I feel like we're actively running away from talking about the film at certain points.
We've left the best to last, at least. The bit where he forgot just all of what Verotika was meant to be and just gave up.
This is, let me see if I'm getting this right. Dorokia, Countess of Blood. And this is the one, I mean, Change of Face never gets past its opening premise. As soon as you get that this woman is taking people's faces, it never goes anywhere else.
Yeah, no.
But this is sort of not getting past an old premise. And you think, well, yeah, I suppose it is quite gross to think about a woman bathing in blood. But since we already know the story of Elizabeth Bathory, and since it's already been the basis for countless other films, what else you got?
Precisely. Yeah, it's the desensitization, and as well as that, it's not like he does anything with it, really.
No,
it's just there. It's kind of hanging on. It's, if anything, oddly enough, the strongest one is first.
Yeah.
The strongest one, mainly because of how odd the imagery in that opening moment is. For the third in this piece, I mean, for something I watched only a couple hours ago, I couldn't tell you much about it. I can tell you it's about Elizabeth Bathory, and I don't know much about her, but I know enough to know that it's sort of a dead concept and that people have adapted it for a long, long time. Even if it's just sort of slightly, ever so slightly, just sort of trickled it into the narrative. Hammer Horror used to do it every now and then. For Danzig to do it now, it's to imply that he has something important to say on it, or a twist that would provide something new that the audience hasn't thought about. But there isn't, and it's kind of damning of the whole sort of trilogy that Verotika is old ideas and old presentations of what Danzig believes is scary, but it's got no new twist. It's still the same message. He thinks what was scary 40 years ago is still scary now.
I think it's telling when you look at some of the other Elizabeth Bathory movies, and you mentioned Hammer, and indeed there is a Hammer movie about Elizabeth Bathory, Countess Dracula, starring Ingrid Pitt. So I think when you're doing something that Hammer were doing in the early 70s, you should have a rethink of how progressive and forward-thinking this is. There is...
something like The Neon Demon.
Yeah.
Something like that. Provocative, new, exciting. What's Verotika?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. In fact, the Elizabeth Bathory section in Verotika is like not new, even within the context of Verotika, because it goes to a bit where the killer has like a trophy room of the heads of her victims mounted, and Danzig is clearly going, "Heads on a wall, man! Have you ever seen anything like this before?" And you think, "Yes, I have." In the last segment where this also happened.
I think the purse strings of Danzig were a little bit tight, and he thought, well, I'm going to get the most out of this cupboard. And he did it twice.
The MFI self-assembly serial killer's trophy room. Yeah.
I can understand that from his perspective. It was a bloody pain in the ass putting those two shelves up. I can see why you want to use them more than once. And one of them, the bottom's on the wrong way around. But I'm not taking them apart again.
I feel like the best episodes of this show when we get an insight into the host's life and the fact that the bottom shelf of your DVD shelf is on backwards.
Yeah, so it's that
qualified.
one there. I put the bottom slot on the wrong way around, so it's meant to have like a nice white finish on the side of it to look very nice. It's just plywood on that side instead. So that's why I put my vinyl box in front of it to cover it up for this episode. That's why there's always a carrier bag on my floor as well, because that covers the other side. Just a nice little nod into how I live. Please excuse the vodka bottles. There's also an empty bottle of bourbon down there.
Oh dear. And you drank all of that while watching Verotika.
I did, the whole bottle, all gone. It's amazing I'm still sat. I feel like that's what Danzig would have wanted, though, for me to watch this with a whole bottle of bourbon.
Absolutely.
And I feel
rock and roll.
On the I did it wrong, didn't I? I did it wrong. But no, I think it's I suppose now, especially because of how much content comes out per year, so bad it's good, that term is thrown around quite a lot. I do think Verotika is a genuine so bad it's good feature, because it has that sort of perspective of, what's he doing? Like, he's gone mad. There are moments in this film where it's not the work of a sane individual. It's the work of someone that thinks he's being edgy and cool, but in actual fact, it's something we associate with a very old generation.
Yeah. And it's like, it's interesting that we are getting some of those, as you say, so bad they're good features now, because I remember about 10 years ago, I was seriously concerned that people had lost the ability to differentiate between a terrible movie and a disappointing one. You know, when you would have people say, "Oh, Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull is like the worst movie I've ever seen. Prometheus is the worst movie I've ever seen."
Yes,
and I think, well, I'm not going to go massively to bat for them, but if they're the worst movie you've ever seen, you've had a pretty charmed life. So in the middle of an increasingly homogenous movie scene dominated by a shrinking number of global corporations, it is very exciting that you do occasionally still get something that is just so miscalculated.
Yeah. And I've always sort of believed that bad is better than boring.
Yeah.
It's, at the very least, a bad film is provoking that reaction. It's provoking an active response from me saying, this is dreadful and I must talk about this with other people. Whereas a boring film, it's hard to sort of get into why a film is boring, because a lot of it, the times, it's just, well, it's nothing special, nothing new, it's nothing bold. Verotika isn't anything new, bold, or exceptional, but it's because of how mismanaged the actual core of it is. These moments that have been shown to us time and time again, how badly they're handled. That's the beauty of it, and I think that's what's the most interesting part of Verotika and why it's so bad it's good. Yeah. If this were a film where he just potted along and made something competent, we wouldn't be talking about this.
No way, no.
If only he'd made something competent. Oh.
Yeah, I think that's a very fine note to end on. Verotika, unquestionably recommended, listeners.
Oh, without question. I'm going to order the Blu-ray. I'm going to get rid of everything on my shelf, all the books, all the films, get rid of them. I just want Verotika on one shelf, and that's it.
What if you added Verotika to your shelf and it turned out to be the thing that finally caused your misbuilt IKEA
It's not
DVD shelf to
misbuilt. I was just clumsy. There's a very big difference. I mean, it's already got The Commuter by Liam Neeson on there. If it was going to collapse now, that would have been the time for it. I've got the Snowman, that Michael Fassbender film. I've got the book.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've got a lot of shit on these shelves. I'm actually in the process of clearing them out, but I have been doing that since February, and I can honestly say, hand on heart, I've gotten more stuff than I've actually gotten rid of. So it's very much a 2 steps forward, 8 steps back situation.
It's a very familiar problem to have. Yes. Yeah.
I think adding Verotika will help, though.
In that it'll remind you not to buy things.
It will, yeah.
It's aversion therapy for film watchers.
Above my desk, I've got a very nice Ralph Steadman print of a drawing of Hunter Thompson. I'm going to take that down, and I'm going to put up a big picture of Glenn Danzig, and it's going to be him pointing at me saying, "No more films."
Son, I've noticed you've been buying some Blu-rays recently, and now I'm going to sit you down and make you smoke a whole pack of Verotika just to show you the error of your ways.
I've already seen the error of my ways, and I'm repenting by buying Verotika.
Oh, well, listeners, if you enjoyed that, and I mean, you probably enjoyed it more than we enjoyed making it, I think. You can donate to our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Geek Show, where you can get a monthly bonus episode of this show, exclusive access to our other movie podcast, Director's Lottery, which isn't available anywhere else, and my Doctor Who reviews. In the meantime, we'll be back next week with more Pop Screen. I've been Graham.
I've been Ewan.
And we'll see you next week.